The most dangerous moment in first contact isn't when someone draws a weapon. It's when someone hears a thought they were never meant to hear. Ethan Walker realized that about 3 seconds before his life became very complicated. The diplomatic station called Halo 9 hung quietly in orbit above a dark violet gas giant nearly 60,000 miles below, its clouds swirling like slow oceans under the starlight. Inside the station's reception hall, gravity hummed softly at Earth standard. The air smelled faintly of ozone and recycled metal, and representatives from 12 alien civilizations stood waiting in a silence so tense it almost had weight. Ethan shifted in his uniform jacket, a simple gray technician's coat with a patch that read Terran Exobiology Division. He wasn't a diplomat, or a soldier, or anyone particularly important. His job was to calibrate environmental systems and make sure visiting species could breathe without their lungs complaining. Normally that meant adjusting atmospheric ratios or temperature ranges. Today it meant standing in a room full of very important beings while pretending he belonged there. A soft chime echoed through the hall as the docking corridor pressurized. Everyone turned toward the entrance. The lights dimmed automatically, a protocol triggered by the arrival of someone important enough that the station itself seemed to hold its breath. Ethan leaned slightly to one side to see past a pair of towering delegates from the Terrellian Consortium. The corridor doors slid open with a smooth hydraulic whisper, and the alien royal stepped into the room. Princess Nyra Valtharis of the Viral Dominion was taller than Ethan expected, nearly 8 feet if he had to guess, moving with the effortless confidence of someone who had never once questioned that every room she entered would belong to her. Her skin carried a deep crimson hue that caught the overhead lights like polished glass, and her long silver hair drifted behind her shoulders as if gravity had only a polite suggestion over it. Golden eyes scanned the chamber slowly, not suspicious, not hostile, just aware in a way that made Ethan feel like the entire station had suddenly become very small. Every alien in the room bowed. Even the species that physically couldn't bow managed some version of the gesture. Ethan hesitated half a second too long before giving a quick nod that probably looked more like a confused shrug. He wasn't trying to be disrespectful. He was mostly trying not to stare, which is exactly when the thought slipped out. It wasn't loud. It wasn't intentional. It was just one of those quick human observations that flash through the mind before common sense can catch them. Nice posture, Ethan thought absently, watching the princess move past the delegates with slow, graceful steps. And then, without meaning to, the second thought followed. She has a really nice... Princess Nyra stopped walking. The entire chamber froze. Ethan blinked once, then twice, because the princess had turned her head slightly in his direction. Not fully, just enough that one golden eye settled directly on him across the room. The faintest smile touched the corner of her mouth. Ethan felt the temperature of the room drop about 10 degrees. Her voice carried across the hall, calm and clear and somehow amused. "Human," she said gently. "Did you mean to think that so loudly?" Ethan's stomach sank somewhere down near his boots. Because in that exact moment, he realized something very important about the legendary vampire royalty of the Viral Dominion. They didn't just hear words. They heard minds. And apparently, his had just introduced itself in the worst possible way imaginable. For exactly 3 seconds, Ethan Walker considered the possibility that fainting might be the most dignified option available to him, but unfortunately his body decided to remain fully conscious while Princess Nyra Valtharis continued looking directly at him from across the chamber. The vast reception hall of Halo 9 remained silent enough that Ethan could hear the low vibration of the station's life support turbine somewhere. Behind the walls nearly 80 feet above the polished floor no one spoke, no one moved. Even the delegates who had been whispering a moment earlier now stood perfectly still, as if the air itself had turned to glass. Ethan cleared his throat, which immediately sounded far louder than he intended. "Your Highness," he said slowly, discovering that his voice had suddenly forgotten how to behave properly. "I can explain that thought if necessary." The princess tilted her head slightly, the motion smooth and curious rather than offended, her silver hair shifting across one shoulder like drifting starlight. "I am certain you could," she replied calmly, though the hint of amusement in her golden eyes suggested she was enjoying the situation far more than anyone else in the room. Ethan felt every diplomatic training video he had ever watched screaming inside his brain that there were approximately 100 better things he could have thought during a first contact ceremony. The closest Terran ambassador to him glanced sideways with the expression of a man silently calculating whether pretending not to know Ethan might still be possible. Princess Nyra stepped forward again, her long stride measured and quiet, the sound of her boots barely touching the floor despite her height. She stopped about 20 feet away from Ethan and studied him with an intensity that made him suddenly aware of every heartbeat inside his chest. Human minds are remarkably loud, she said thoughtfully, as if sharing a scientific observation. Most species think in structured patterns, but your kind thinks in sudden flashes like meteor showers. Ethan blinked, once trying very hard not to imagine the meteor that had just exploded inside his own head. I will try to reduce the brightness next time, he said. Carefully, a faint ripple of laughter moved through the chamber, not loud, but enough that several alien representatives visibly relaxed. Princess Nyra's smile widened slightly. Interesting, she said. You are embarrassed, yet you chose honesty instead of denial. Ethan shrugged a little, because it seemed like the safest response available. Where I come from, honesty usually gets you in less trouble than pretending something obvious did not happen. The princess considered that for a moment, her eyes narrowing just slightly, as if examining an unfamiliar concept. Your species values direct emotion, she said. That is unusual. Ethan nodded. Humans are not very good at hiding what we feel, even when we try. The silence returned, but it felt different now, less tense, more curious. The princess walked slowly in a small circle around him, not threatening, just observing the way a researcher might examine an unexpected discovery. You thought something bold, she said at last, yet your mind carries no hostility, only curiosity. Ethan exhaled slowly because that sounded like the closest thing to good news he had heard in the last 30 seconds. Curiosity is kind of our thing, he replied. It is the reason we keep flying millions of miles away from home, looking for people to talk to. Princess Nyra stopped beside him and leaned slightly closer, not invading his space, but close enough that he could see faint patterns of light moving beneath her crimson skin like distant constellations. Human Ethan Walker, she said softly, I believe you may be the first being in this room whose thoughts were not carefully rehearsed, and for the first time since she entered the hall, the ancient alien princess looked genuinely interested. The silence in the reception hall slowly dissolved into quiet conversation as the diplomatic ceremony finally continued, but the atmosphere had shifted in a way that no protocol officer could have predicted. Ethan Walker stood where he was, trying to look like a normal environmental technician instead of the human whose thoughts had just been publicly noticed by an ancient alien princess. Representatives from a dozen star systems resumed their formal greetings, yet many of their eyes drifted back toward Ethan and the tall crimson figure beside him. Princess Nyra Valtharis did not immediately return to the center of the chamber. Instead, she remained near him, studying him with calm curiosity, as if he had become an unexpected scientific discovery. Ethan felt the faint hum of the station through the soles of his boots, and the distant glow of the violet gas giant outside the panoramic windows nearly 50 miles below the station slowly turning through space. After several seconds, he finally spoke quietly. Your Highness, if my thoughts are still loud, I apologize. I promise they are usually less embarrassing when I am fixing air filters. The princess looked toward the enormous observation window where starlight reflected across her golden eyes. Then she glanced back at him. I am not offended, she said. In truth, I find the experience refreshing. Most minds in rooms like this are extremely disciplined, carefully organized, carefully controlled. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, because disciplined was not a word anyone had ever used to describe him. Humans tend to think out loud inside our heads, he admitted. It happens when our brains move faster than our good judgment. A faint smile touched her expression again. I noticed, she said, your thoughts appear spontaneous, almost chaotic, yet there is sincerity within them. Ethan followed her gaze toward the diplomats speaking across the hall and lowered his voice slightly. Chaos is kind of our specialty. Humanity has only been traveling between stars for a little over 2 centuries. Most of our best discoveries started with someone thinking something reckless and deciding to investigate anyway. Princess Nyra folded her hands lightly behind her back and walked slowly beside him toward the observation window. Her height made the massive glass panels seem smaller, and the faint glow of the gas giant painted soft violet light across the floor below them for several seconds. She said nothing, as if listening not only to his words, but to the quiet movement of his thoughts. Humans evolved in unpredictable environments. She said eventually your species learned to adapt through curiosity rather than caution. Ethan considered that and nodded slightly. That is probably accurate. Curiosity helped us invent flight, electricity, computers, and eventually starships. It also helped us accidentally break a lot of things along the way. The princess studied the enormous storm systems moving across the planet beneath them, then turned back to Ethan again. Your earlier thought, she said calmly, did not carry disrespect, it carried observation. Ethan felt his ears grow warm, because hearing that analyzed out loud was somehow worse than the original moment. I suppose that is one way to describe it, he said carefully. Naira's golden eyes brightened with something almost like amusement. I have met thousands of diplomats during my lifetime, she said quietly. Many of them practiced their words for months before speaking to me, yet you said the first honest thing that crossed your mind. Ethan looked across the station interior, where alien delegates discussed treaties and trade routes under carefully rehearsed language. Then he shrugged slightly. Honesty is sometimes easier than pretending to be impressive. The princess watched him for a long moment, then spoke in a softer voice. Ethan Walker, you may not realize it yet, but a mind that does not hide its thoughts is extremely rare in interstellar politics, and for reasons I am still trying to understand, I find that rarity very interesting. The diplomatic ceremony on Halo 9 stretched on for nearly another hour, but Ethan Walker barely heard most of it because standing beside Princess Naira Valtharis had quietly turned him into the most nervous environmental technician in 3-star systems. The reception hall slowly filled with controlled conversation again, as alien representatives exchanged greetings and carefully worded statements. Yet every few minutes Ethan noticed someone glance toward the tall crimson princess and the human standing next to her, as if trying to understand why she had chosen that exact spot near the observation window. Princess Naira seemed entirely comfortable with the attention. She watched the room with calm patience, her golden eyes reflecting the soft violet glow of the massive gas giant. Turning nearly 60,000 miles below the station, Ethan folded his arms loosely and tried to look like someone whose thoughts were not apparently broadcast at the volume of a space station. Alarm, Your Highness, he said quietly after a moment. May I ask a question? The princess turned slightly toward him. Of course, Ethan Walker, you have already proven that your mind prefers honesty over hesitation. Ethan smiled faintly at that. I was wondering how often this happens. What happens? She asked. The accidental thought reading thing, Ethan replied, because if I have already set a diplomatic record, I would like to know. Naira studied him with visible curiosity before answering. Telepathy among my species is constant, but what you experienced is unusual. Most minds are shielded by disciplined diplomats train themselves to maintain quiet mental patterns. She glanced across the room where a cluster of alien officials were discussing trade routes with careful expressions. They know I can hear them thinking, so they think very carefully. Ethan nodded slowly. That sounds exhausting. The princess tilted her head slightly. Humans do not train their minds in that way. Not really, Ethan admitted. Most humans can barely stop thinking about lunch during important meetings. Naira looked genuinely intrigued. That explains the chaotic rhythm of your thoughts. Ethan followed her gaze toward the observation window, where faint lightning storms rolled across the atmosphere of the planet below. I guess humans evolved with brains that are always running. We are always planning, imagining, wondering what might happen next. Curiosity again, the princess said softly. Exactly, Ethan replied. Curiosity got our species into space in the first place. It also got us into a lot of trouble before that. Naira remained silent for several seconds, as if listening to the quiet patterns moving through his mind. Then she spoke with thoughtful interest. Your thoughts shift quickly from observation to humor to self-criticism and back again. That is unusual for a sentient species. Ethan shrugged lightly. Humans spend a lot of time inside their own heads. If we took every thought seriously, we would never get anything done. The princess watched him with that same careful fascination she had shown earlier. You treat your thoughts like weather passing through your mind instead of commands that must be obeyed. Ethan blinked because that description felt strangely accurate. I guess that is one way to put it. A slow smile appeared again on Naira's face. Ethan Walker, I have listened to thousands of minds during diplomatic gatherings. Most are cautious, some are calculating, others are filled with rehearsed words waiting for the right moment to be spoken. She stepped a little closer, her voice thoughtful rather than intimidating, but yours is the first mind I have heard that seems completely comfortable being unprepared. Ethan considered that for a moment, then chuckled softly. Being unprepared is another human specialty. Naira's golden eyes reflected the distant stars beyond the station windows as she studied him again. That may be true, she said quietly, but unpredictability can also be a form of strength, and for reasons I am still discovering, the human mind may be far more interesting than any carefully rehearsed diplomat in this room. The diplomatic ceremony finally began to wind down as the last of the formal introductions echoed across Halo 9's reception hall, yet the quiet gravity of the moment had changed in a way that no official schedule could explain. Ethan Walker leaned lightly against the rail near the panoramic observation window, watching slow rivers of violet lightning move across the massive gas giant almost 60,000 miles beneath the station. The storm clouds turned slowly like an ocean made of light and shadow, reflecting faint purple patterns across the polished floor behind him. Most of the delegates had moved toward the central chamber, where refreshments and quieter negotiations were beginning, but Princess Naira Valtharis had not followed them. Instead, she remained beside Ethan, as if the conversation between them had become more interesting than the politics unfolding 20 yards away. Ethan finally glanced sideways at her. Your Highness, I should probably return to my actual job before someone realizes the environmental technician has been missing for half the ceremony. Naira looked toward the gathering diplomats, and then back at him with calm curiosity. Does your work normally require standing near windows and accidentally thinking memorable observations? Ethan let out a quiet laugh. Not usually. My job mostly involves monitoring atmospheric controls and making sure visiting species can breathe without their lungs complaining. The princess considered that for a moment. A caretaker of environments? Then that sounds more important than many titles in this room. Ethan shrugged slightly. Back on Earth, it mostly means replacing filters and checking pressure systems. But if the oxygen levels drop 3%, everyone suddenly remembers who the technician is. Naira's golden eyes brightened with interest. 3%? Ethan nodded. Humans are very sensitive to air quality. Even a small change can make people uncomfortable, which is why Halo 9 has about 400 environmental sensors running at all times. The princess walked slowly toward the glass again, her tall silhouette outlined by the glow of the distant planet beneath them. Your species builds machines that monitor invisible elements of life, she said thoughtfully. Ethan followed her gaze. Oxygen, nitrogen, carbon levels, temperature, humidity, gravity calibration. We have learned that small things can keep entire civilizations running smoothly. For several seconds Naira remained quiet, as if listening to the rhythm of his thoughts again. Then she spoke with a tone that carried genuine curiosity. Earlier you said humans think constantly about what might happen next. Ethan nodded. That is how we survive. We imagine problems before they appear and try to solve them early. The princess looked back at him. Your mind is doing that now. Ethan blinked once, realizing she was correct, because a dozen quiet thoughts had already been forming in the background. He gave a sheepish smile. I was wondering how long it will take before someone important asks why the alien princess is talking to a technician instead of a diplomat. Naira's expression softened with amusement. I suspect that question has already appeared in several minds across the room. Ethan glanced over his shoulder and noticed a few cautious glances from distant officials. I figured. The princess turned fully toward him, her voice calm but thoughtful. Ethan Walker, your mind does something unusual. When you think about possible problems, you also think about possible solutions at the same time. Ethan nodded slowly. That is called planning. Naira studied him with quiet fascination. No, she said softly, planning is common. What you do is different. You imagine outcomes that have not happened yet and treat them as opportunities. Ethan looked back toward the endless stars outside the station windows, then shrugged lightly. Humans call that curiosity, and curiosity is the reason we keep exploring places we probably should not be yet. The princess watched him for a long moment and then said quietly, I am beginning to understand why your species reached the stars so quickly. The reception hall of Halo 9 had grown quieter as many of the delegates moved into smaller discussion groups scattered across the wide circular chamber. Yet Ethan Walker and Princess Naira Valtharis still remained near the panoramic observation window, where the slow rotation of the gas giant beneath the station cast shifting violet light across the polished metal floor. Ethan rested his hands lightly on the rail while watching faint lightning storms ripple across the clouds thousands of miles below. For a moment neither of them spoke. The soft hum of the station's environmental systems filled the silence, along with the distant murmur of alien voices discussing trade routes, scientific exchanges, and territorial boundaries. Naira seemed less interested in those negotiations than in the humans standing beside her. Ethan noticed her gaze drift slightly, as if listening again to the quiet motion of his thoughts. "You are analyzing something," she said softly. Ethan blinked once and looked over at her. "Am I?" The princess nodded. "Your mind just imagined 3 different scenarios in which a station environmental system could malfunction." Ethan chuckled quietly, because she was exactly right. That is what technicians do. We spend most of our time imagining problems before they happen. Naira tilted her head with curiosity. "Explain." Ethan pointed upward toward the curved ceiling where several discrete air circulation vents were built into the structure. "This station maintains breathable conditions for more than 20 species at the same time. Oxygen levels, humidity, gravity, pressure. If even one system drifts too far from normal, people start feeling it immediately." The princess followed his gesture with calm attention. "And you monitor these invisible changes constantly?" Ethan nodded. "Every second, hundreds of sensors across the station. If one reading moves outside the safe range, an alert appears on my console. Then I run diagnostics before the issue becomes serious." Naira remained quiet for several seconds, absorbing that information. "You watch systems most people never notice." Ethan shrugged. "That is the job. If everything works properly, no one thinks about the air they breathe or the gravity under their feet." Naira looked toward the diplomats gathered across the hall. "Those leaders believe they are negotiating the future of entire star systems, yet the stability of this room depends on someone adjusting airflow percentages." Ethan smiled slightly. "That is the strange thing about technology. The smallest systems often support the biggest decisions." The princess turned toward the observation window, again her golden eyes reflecting distant starlight. "Your thoughts predicted several potential failures just now." Ethan nodded again. "That is called troubleshooting. We imagine what might break so we can fix it early." Naira studied him carefully. "Ethan Walker, your mind approaches problems the same way explorers approach unknown territory." Ethan leaned against the rail, considering that comparison. "I suppose that makes sense. Humans have been explorers for most of our history. First oceans, then continents, then space." The princess spoke thoughtfully. "And every exploration begins with curiosity." Ethan looked at the storm clouds rolling across the planet beneath them. "Exactly. Curiosity pushes us to ask, what is over the next horizon?" Naira watched the distant lightning flicker beneath the clouds for a long moment before speaking. "Again, my species has existed for thousands of years," she said quietly. "During that time, we learned caution, discipline, and patience, but curiosity was never our primary strength." Ethan glanced toward her. "You are curious right now?" Naira smiled faintly. "Yes," she admitted, "I am curious about the human mind." Ethan folded his arms loosely and looked back toward the endless field of stars beyond the station windows. "That curiosity is probably why humans and your people are talking at all." Naira studied him thoughtfully. "Perhaps," she said, "or perhaps it is because your thoughts are the first ones I have heard today that are not trying to impress me." And as she listened to the quiet rhythm of his mind again, the ancient princess realized that the unpredictable honesty of a human technician might be more fascinating than the carefully planned strategies of every diplomat in the room. The reception hall lights dimmed slightly as Halo 9's station clock shifted into evening cycle, though in orbit above the massive gas giant. There was no real night, only the illusion of it created by artificial lighting. Ethan Walker noticed the change immediately, because environmental technicians were trained to notice small shifts in systems. Most people ignored the soft white glow of the overhead panels, warmed by 2 degrees in color temperature, making the chamber feel calmer, more relaxed, while the violet glow from the planet below deepened beyond the glass observation wall. Princess Naira Valtharis seemed to notice the change as well, though not through sensors or instruments. She turned her head slightly, studying the ceiling lights with quiet interest. "The atmosphere has changed," she said. Ethan nodded instinctively. "Yes, the station switches lighting cycles every 8 hours. It helps species with circadian rhythms maintain stable sleep patterns." Naira looked back toward the diplomats scattered across the room. Some were beginning to leave the chamber, while others continued quiet negotiations over illuminated data Tablets, even their posture changed with the softer light voices, lowered movements, slowed your species, designs environments, not just for survival, but for comfort. She observed. Ethan leaned back against the rail beside the observation window. We learned a long time ago that comfort helps people think clearly. When humans feel relaxed, they solve problems better. Naira watched the diplomats again, considering that statement. That explains why this station feels different from many interstellar facilities. Ethan tilted his head slightly. Different. How? On many stations the design focuses on efficiency, she said. Straight corridors, harsh lighting, constant motion, but this place feels balanced. Ethan smiled faintly. That is because humans built it. Halo 9 was designed as a neutral meeting ground, not just a transportation hub. The princess turned back toward the glass, where the distant planet slowly rotated beneath them. Lightning flashed silently through the clouds thousands of miles below, and the reflection of the storm briefly illuminated her crimson skin. You said earlier that curiosity drives your species, she said quietly. Ethan nodded. Curiosity and stubbornness. We like to figure out how things work. Naira looked toward him again. Your mind is doing that now. Ethan blinked once. What do you mean? You are analyzing this conversation, she replied. You are wondering why an alien princess is spending her time speaking with a technician instead of discussing treaties with diplomats. Ethan let out a small laugh, because once again she was exactly correct. That thought did cross my mind. The princess tilted her head slightly, as if examining something fascinating. What conclusion did you reach? Ethan considered the question for a moment before answering. Honestly, I assumed you were curious. Naira's golden eyes reflected the distant lightning storms again. That is correct, she said. My people have existed for thousands of years. During that time we mastered strategy, politics, and discipline, yet curiosity has never been our defining trait. Ethan looked at her thoughtfully. Humans are almost the opposite. We are curious first and cautious second. The princess studied him carefully. And that difference may explain why your species expanded through the stars so quickly. Ethan folded his arms loosely. That, and the fact that humans get bored very easily. Naira blinked once, clearly surprised by the answer. Bored? Ethan nodded. If we stay in one place too long, we start wondering what is beyond the next horizon. So eventually someone builds a ship and goes to find out. The princess watched him for several seconds, as if processing that idea. Your species travels across the galaxy because you become bored. Ethan shrugged with a quiet grin. That and curiosity, they are closely related. Naira turned again toward the endless field of stars beyond the station glass and listened to the restless rhythm of Ethan Walker's thoughts, swirling with questions, ideas, and quiet observations. For the first time in centuries she realized she was not simply studying the human mind, she was beginning to enjoy it. The artificial evening cycle deepened across Halo 9, and the diplomatic hall slowly transformed from a formal gathering space into something quieter and more reflective. The brighter overhead lights faded another level and soft amber tones replaced them, while the giant planet below continued its endless rotation beneath the station. Ethan Walker noticed the moment the environmental system adjusted the internal humidity by a fraction of a percent. It was a tiny change, barely noticeable to most species, but years of working with life support systems had trained him to recognize it immediately. The air felt slightly warmer, more relaxed. Princess Naira Valtherus seemed to sense the shift as well, though not through instruments. She closed her eyes for a brief second, as if listening to something deeper than the room itself. Your station breathes, she said softly. Ethan turned toward her with a curious smile. That is one way to describe it. Life support systems are designed to mimic natural environmental rhythms, temperature, air pressure, lighting cycles. Naira opened her eyes again, studying the chamber around them. It is subtle, but I can feel the difference. The diplomats across the room appear calmer. Ethan nodded. That is intentional. When negotiations last for hours, small environmental adjustments help reduce stress levels. Humans discovered a long time ago that comfortable people make better decisions. Naira looked toward the clusters of alien representatives, now speaking quietly around circular tables. Some leaned closer to one another, their voices steady and thoughtful rather than tense, and guarded. Your species designs not only machines, but emotional environments, she observed. Ethan rested his arms along the rail beside the observation window. We try to. When humans first started building stations like this, we realized something important. Space can feel cold and distant. If you want people to cooperate, you have to make the environment feel welcoming. Naira studied him again, and the faint reflection of lightning storms from the planet below shimmered across her golden eyes. You think about these details constantly, she said. Ethan laughed softly. Not always, but it becomes a habit. When you spend years monitoring life support systems, your brain automatically imagines how everything is connected. Naira listened quietly to the quiet current of his thoughts again, then spoke with thoughtful curiosity. Ethan Walker, there is something unusual about the way your mind works. Ethan tilted his head slightly. Curious, unusual, or concerning? Unusual. Curious, she replied. Your thoughts move like flowing water. You observe a system, then immediately imagine how it might evolve. Ethan glanced toward the swirling clouds far below the station. That is called problem solving. Humans practice it from childhood. If something breaks, we try to understand why, then we imagine how to fix it. Naira stepped closer to the glass, watching a distant flash of lightning ripple through the violet atmosphere thousands of miles beneath them. Your species imagines solutions before problems even occur. Ethan nodded. That is why our ships keep improving. Every generation builds something slightly better than the last. The princess turned toward him again, her expression thoughtful. When I listen to the minds of most diplomats, I hear careful silence, controlled thoughts, guarded emotions. But when I listen to yours, I hear curiosity, questions, possibilities. Ethan gave a small shrug. That is what curiosity sounds like. Naira studied him for a long moment, and then said quietly, in my people, curiosity was once considered a dangerous trait. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Dangerous? She nodded. It led individuals to challenge traditions, question authority, explore ideas beyond established knowledge. Ethan smiled faintly. Because the idea sounded familiar on Earth, we usually call that innovation. Naira's expression softened with something close to admiration. Your species built an entire civilization on a trait my people once feared. Ethan looked back toward the distant stars outside the station windows and spoke in a calm voice. Curiosity can be uncomfortable, but it is also the reason humans keep discovering new things. The princess listened to the quiet, restless rhythm of his mind again, and for the first time in centuries, she wondered if curiosity might not be dangerous at all. Perhaps it was simply the beginning of something extraordinary. The quiet evening atmosphere of Halo 9 deepened as more delegates gradually left the reception hall and moved toward private conference rooms along the outer ring of the station. Ethan Walker remained beside the panoramic observation window, while the massive gas giant below slowly rolled beneath them, its violet storms flashing silently across an atmosphere nearly 40,000 miles deep. The station lighting softened again, creating a warm amber glow that reflected across the polished metal floor. Princess Naira Valtharis stood beside him with calm composure, her tall figure outlined by distant starlight, while the faint hum of life support systems continued their steady rhythm. Ethan noticed the environmental console embedded into the nearby wall display a small fluctuation in airflow pressure, barely a fraction of a percent, but enough to catch his trained attention. He glanced at it briefly, and then back toward the window. Naira's voice came softly a moment later. Your mind just noticed something. Ethan nodded without surprise. The airflow sensor near this section of the hall drifted slightly outside its normal range. It is not dangerous, but it means one of the circulation regulators will probably need recalibration soon. Naira looked toward the wall display. Even though the numbers were too small for most species to read from that distance, you recognized that in less than a second. Ethan shrugged lightly. It is a habit. When you work with life support systems, you learn to notice very small patterns before they become real problems. The princess studied him thoughtfully. Your species places extraordinary trust in individuals responsible for invisible systems. Ethan looked around the chamber, where diplomats still discussed treaties beneath the warm station lights. They may not realize it, but every person in this room trusts the technicians maintaining the air, gravity, and temperature. If any of those systems fail, the negotiations suddenly become much less important. Naira turned slowly toward him, her golden eyes reflecting the shifting glow of distant lightning storms below. The human mind does something unusual when it observes potential failure, she said. Ethan raised an eyebrow. How so? When most species sense risk, their thoughts become cautious, she explained. But when you sense risk, your thoughts immediately begin constructing solutions. Ethan considered that observation for a moment before nodding. Humans like solving problems. It gives us a sense of progress. The princess remained silent as she listened again to the quiet movement of ideas forming inside his thoughts. Diagnostic procedures, airflow recalibration, backup circulation loops, simple practical solutions flowing naturally through his mind. You imagine the repair steps without conscious effort, She said that process seems almost instinctive. Ethan smiled faintly. That is probably because humans break things constantly. We learn early that fixing problems is part of everyday life. Naira's expression softened slightly, as if the idea amused her. My people spend decades mastering strategy before assuming positions of responsibility, she said, yet you learn similar habits simply by maintaining environmental systems. Ethan looked back toward the vast planet turning beneath the station and then toward the stars beyond it. Exploration and engineering teach the same lesson. Every environment has hidden systems. If you want to survive in space, you learn to understand them. The princess studied him for a long moment and then spoke quietly. Ethan Walker, there is something extraordinary about a mind that treats uncertainty as an invitation rather than a threat. Ethan glanced at her with curiosity. Humans usually just call that curiosity. Naira turned once more toward the endless stars outside the station window and listened to the steady rhythm of his thoughts flowing with questions, possibilities, and quiet optimism. For the first time in many centuries, she realized that the human approach to uncertainty might not simply lead to discovery, it might reshape the future of every civilization. Gathered inside this station, the quiet balance of Halo 9 continued for several minutes after Ethan Walker noticed the slight airflow fluctuation near the observation deck, yet the station itself seemed to respond almost immediately. Somewhere deep within the layered engineering corridors beneath the diplomatic hall, an automated regulator adjusted its cycle, and the soft movement of air across the chamber returned to its perfect rhythm. Ethan glanced briefly at the wall display again and gave a small nod as the numbers returned to their standard range. Princess Naira Valtharis observed the subtle shift without needing to read the instruments. The airflow stabilized, she said. Ethan rested his arms lightly against the rail beside the window. Yes, the backup regulator corrected the imbalance. It happens automatically most of the time. Naira studied the wall panel with quiet interest. Your systems repair themselves when possible. Ethan nodded. Humans design most infrastructure with layered redundancy. If one component drifts outside the safe range, another compensates before anyone even notices. The princess looked across the reception hall where the remaining diplomats continued their calm discussions beneath the warm station lights. It seems your species has learned to expect failure. Ethan considered that question for a moment before answering. We do not expect failure exactly, but we prepare for it. Space is unpredictable, and preparation keeps people safe. Naira turned slowly toward the massive observation window. Again, the giant planet beneath them continued its endless rotation, while violet lightning flashed quietly across the storm systems thousands of miles below. Your mind predicted that fluctuation before it fully appeared, she said. Ethan smiled faintly. Environmental technicians spend years watching data streams. Patterns begin to stand out after a while. The princess listened to the quiet rhythm of his thoughts, once more noticing how easily his mind moved from observation to explanation to possibility. Your thoughts move like engineers mapping a structure, she said. Every observation leads to another connection. Ethan looked out toward the distant stars beyond the station glass. Humans build systems everywhere we go, ships, stations, cities. It teaches us to see the invisible frameworks that hold everything together. Naira turned slightly toward him again. That includes people, does it not? Ethan raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? When you observe the diplomats across the room, she explained, you are not only analyzing environmental conditions, you are also studying their behavior. Ethan glanced over his shoulder toward the cluster of alien representatives speaking near the center of the hall, then shrugged lightly. I suppose that is true. Humans are naturally curious about how people think. The princess gave a thoughtful nod. Your species analyzes both machines and minds. Ethan laughed softly. That is because both systems follow patterns. Sometimes those patterns are easy to see, and sometimes they are hidden beneath the surface. Naira stepped closer to the glass, where distant stars reflected in the curved observation window. During the last hour, she said quietly, I have listened to many minds in this chamber. Some are calculating, some are cautious, some are filled with rehearsed words, waiting for the perfect diplomatic moment. Ethan leaned against the rail beside her. And mine is none of those things. The princess allowed a faint smile to appear. That is correct. Your mind does not hide its curiosity or its uncertainty. Ethan watched a distant storm swirl across the planet beneath them and spoke in a calm voice. Humans learned long ago that Curiosity leads to discovery, even when we are not certain where the path will lead. Naira listened again to the steady motion of thoughts flowing through his mind, questions, possibilities, observations, all moving together like currents beneath the surface of an ocean. For a moment, she said nothing, then she spoke with quiet realization. Ethan Walker, there is something profoundly unusual about a species that treats uncertainty not as danger, but as opportunity. Ethan looked toward the stars beyond the station and answered simply, that is how exploration begins. The calm rhythm of Halo 9 continued as the diplomatic hall grew quieter and the last of the formal discussions shifted into private conference chambers beyond the circular corridor. Ethan Walker remained near the panoramic observation window beside Princess Naira Valtharis, while the giant gas planet below the station slowly rolled beneath them like a living ocean of violet clouds. The distant lightning storms flashed softly across the atmosphere thousands of miles below, casting faint pulses of light across the glass and reflecting gently across Naira's crimson skin. Ethan rested his hands along the rail while listening to the steady hum of the station systems that had become as familiar to him as breathing. The environmental network continued to run smoothly, but his attention drifted towards something less technical. Now the princess stood silently beside him, yet her mind felt unusually focused. Her golden eyes remained fixed on the distant stars beyond the station's observation wall. Ethan finally broke the silence. You are thinking about something new? Naira turned slightly toward him. Your mind noticed that Ethan gave a small nod. Humans are good at noticing when someone becomes quiet for a reason. Naira studied him thoughtfully, then spoke in a calm voice. I have been listening to the minds of every representative who entered this station today. Their thoughts were disciplined, structured, cautious. Ethan glanced across the hall where only a handful of diplomats remained, speaking in hushed tones. That is how diplomacy usually works. People choose their words carefully so they do not create misunderstandings. Naira nodded slightly. Yes, yet their minds remain guarded, even when they are silent. Ethan leaned lightly against the rail. That sounds exhausting. The princess looked at him with faint amusement. It is necessary when political consequences extend across star systems. Ethan considered that for a moment before responding. Humans try to do the same thing sometimes, but we are not very good at it. Naira's eyes reflected the starlight outside the window. That much I have already observed. Your thoughts move freely, even when you attempt restraint. Ethan laughed quietly. That is because human brains generate ideas faster than our social filters can organize them. The princess listened again to the steady movement of his thoughts. Questions about the station systems, observations about the diplomats, curiosity about alien cultures, all flowing naturally without rigid structure. Your mind explores possibilities constantly, she said. Ethan shrugged lightly. That is what curiosity does. It keeps asking questions. Naira stepped closer to the observation glass, where distant stars shimmered against the darkness of space. My species once feared curiosity, she said quietly. Long ago, individuals who asked too many questions were considered disruptive. Ethan raised an eyebrow. That seems unfortunate. The princess continued watching the stars. It created stability, but it also slowed progress. Ethan studied her expression carefully. So your civilization chose order over exploration? Naira nodded slowly. For many centuries that choice brought peace and stability, yet listening to the human mind has revealed a different path. Ethan leaned against the rail again, curious about her conclusion. And what path is that? The princess turned toward him, her golden eyes calm but thoughtful. A civilization driven by curiosity evolves differently. It accepts uncertainty as the price of discovery. Ethan smiled faintly. That is a pretty accurate description of humanity. Naira studied him for a long moment, while the quiet storms below continued to flash across the giant planet beneath the station. For the first time in centuries, she felt something unfamiliar stirring within her thoughts. Not discipline, not strategy, but a question that refused to remain silent. Perhaps, she said softly, curiosity is not a weakness after all. Perhaps it is the force that moves civilizations forward. Ethan looked out toward the endless stars beyond Halo 9 and answered simply, that is exactly what humans believe. The quiet stillness around the observation deck of Halo 9 felt deeper now as the diplomatic gathering slowly dissolved into smaller conversations. Behind them, Ethan Walker remained beside the panoramic glass, while the giant gas planet below continued its slow rotation. Storms flashing faint violet light across the endless Atmosphere thousands of miles beneath the station, the artificial night. Cycle inside the hall had fully settled, and the lighting now carried a warm golden tone that reflected softly along the polished metal rail beneath Ethan's hands for several moments. Neither he nor Princess Nyra Valthyris spoke. The silence between them no longer carried tension or curiosity alone, it carried reflection. Nyra's golden eyes remained fixed on the distant stars beyond the station window, while Ethan noticed the subtle shift in her thoughts, long pauses between ideas, deeper analysis. Quieter questions. Humans were not the only ones capable of curiosity. It seemed. Finally Nyra spoke in a voice softer than before. Your species built this station as a meeting ground between civilizations. Ethan nodded slightly. Halo 9 was designed to be neutral territory. No one nation controls it. Every species visiting here shares responsibility for keeping it running. Nyra turned her gaze slightly toward him. Your people trust strangers with something so important. Ethan smiled faintly. Humans learned early that cooperation often leads to stronger results than competition alone. The princess listened carefully to the quiet confidence in his thoughts. You believe trust creates progress? Ethan considered the question while watching a distant storm ripple across the clouds far below. Not automatically, he said slowly, but trust creates the opportunity for progress. Nyra studied his expression with careful attention. In my civilization, trust is extended only after centuries of observation. Ethan gave a small, thoughtful nod. That approach probably prevents many mistakes. The princess stepped closer to the glass again, yet it also prevents many discoveries. Ethan looked at her with mild curiosity. That sounds like the voice of curiosity speaking. Nyra allowed a faint smile to appear. Perhaps it is. The two of them stood quietly for another moment, while the station hummed gently around them. Beyond the observation window, the endless field of stars stretched across the darkness of space, each point of light representing distant systems, unexplored possibilities, and civilizations waiting to meet one another. Nyra finally spoke again. When I first arrived on this station, I expected to hear only careful thoughts from trained diplomats. Ethan chuckled softly. I suspect my mind disrupted that expectation. The princess nodded slightly. It did. Yet the disruption revealed something important. Ethan raised an eyebrow. And what was that? Nyra turned toward him fully, now her golden eyes calm but thoughtful. The human mind is not disciplined in the same way as other species, she said. Instead it flows with ideas, questions, possibilities. Ethan leaned against the rail again, listening. That sounds accurate, the princess continued. Yet within that flow there is something powerful. Your thoughts do not fear uncertainty. They explore it. Ethan looked out toward the distant stars again. Humans call that curiosity. Nyra studied him for a long moment, and then spoke with quiet realization. Curiosity may be the most valuable resource your species possesses. Ethan gave a small smile. That might explain why we keep building ships and traveling farther into the unknown. Nyra turned once more toward the endless universe beyond the station glass and listened to the quiet rhythm of his thoughts, still moving with restless curiosity. Questions forming ideas, evolving possibilities unfolding one after another, and for the first time in centuries the ancient princess felt the same quiet spark rising within her own mind, the desire not simply to observe the universe, but to understand it. The observation deck of Halo 9 had grown almost completely quiet now as the final diplomatic discussions moved deeper into the station's inner chambers, leaving only the distant murmur of voices beyond the curved corridor. Ethan Walker remained beside the great panoramic window, where the endless darkness of space stretched outward in silent brilliance. Beneath the station, the enormous gas giant continued its slow rotation, clouds of violet and silver drifting across an atmosphere tens of thousands of miles deep. Lightning flashed far below like distant whispers of energy, illuminating the vast storms that had been turning long before Halo 9 had ever been built. Ethan rested his hands lightly against the rail, while listening to the familiar hum of the environmental systems hidden behind the walls. Life support regulators, airflow stabilizers, pressure monitors, all working together in quiet harmony. Princess Nyra Valthyris stood beside him, her tall form still outlined by the faint starlight beyond the glass. Yet her thoughts felt different now, no longer analyzing the human mind with distant curiosity, but reflecting on something deeper. The station breathed steadily, she said after a long silence. Ethan gave a small nod. The environmental network is running perfectly tonight. That means everyone inside can focus on their work instead of worrying about survival. Naira turned slightly toward him and studied his expression. Your species dedicates enormous effort to maintaining conditions that others rarely notice. Ethan shrugged lightly. Humans learned that stability allows people to think clearly. When the environment is safe, the mind becomes free to explore new ideas. The princess listened carefully to the quiet rhythm of his thoughts, still moving with curiosity, still examining possibilities. Even in the calm silence between them, your mind has not stopped asking questions since we began speaking, she observed. Ethan smiled faintly. That is difficult for humans to do. Curiosity tends to keep the mind active. Naira stepped closer to the observation glass again and looked out across the field of distant stars. My people once believed that stability required strict control over thought, she said slowly. Questions were discouraged because they could challenge established traditions. Ethan watched the reflection of the swirling planet below move across the glass. Curiosity usually challenges traditions. That is part of how civilizations grow. Naira considered his words while distant lightning flickered beneath the station like soft pulses of energy in the clouds. Perhaps that is why your species has advanced so quickly, she said. You allow curiosity to guide exploration rather than suppress it. Ethan leaned comfortably against the rail beside her. Humans do not always know where curiosity will lead, but it usually reveals something worth learning. The princess turned toward him fully, now her golden eyes calm, but bright with new understanding. When I first listened to your thoughts earlier today, she said, I heard a mind that seemed unguarded and unpredictable. Ethan laughed quietly. That description still sounds accurate. Naira allowed a faint smile to appear. Yet what I discovered was not chaos, she continued. It was curiosity, moving freely, without fear. Ethan looked out toward the endless universe beyond Halo 9, where distant stars glimmered across the darkness like possibilities waiting to be explored. Curiosity built our ships, he said. Softly, it carried humans beyond our own world and into the wider galaxy. Naira followed his gaze across the stars and listened once more to the steady, restless rhythm of his thoughts, ideas, questions, hopes, all flowing together like a current that refused to stand still. For the first time in centuries, the ancient princess felt that same quiet current moving within her own mind, not imposed by duty or tradition, but sparked by the simple human willingness to ask what lies beyond the next horizon. After a long moment, she spoke with quiet certainty. Ethan Walker, your species may have discovered the greatest power in the universe. Ethan glanced toward her with curiosity. And what power is that? Naira looked out across the stars again and answered softly, the courage to wonder what comes next.